Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in 1 or 2 more minutes. We're just going to let a couple more people filter in. We're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for State of Roseville Water. We're happy that you are here. My name is Maurice Cheney. I'm the Public Information Officer for Environmental Utilities. And if you don't know who we are your water, wastewater, and solid waste provider here in Roseville. Today, we have Sean Bigley, our Assistant EU Director, George Hansen, our Water Utility Manager, and Bobby Alvarez, our Water Conservation Administrator. These three folks will be stepping through a slideshow to talk everything related to water. But before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping items to get us going this evening. Next slide. So we're going to be recording tonight's video for those who can't attend, and we're going to be posting this on our YouTube channel, as well as sending out a recap of the meeting and posting information on our website. And for now, mics are going to be muted so we can minimize any noise, but you can engage and you can submit questions. You might have a question and answer icon on your screen. You can submit questions there. We have folks in the background who's going to be monitoring those and answering them or queuing up these questions towards the end. But if you have any questions along the way, you can use the chat feature as well. If there's something that needs more clarification, certainly use that or provide that question in the question and answer as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Sean Bigley, our Assistant Director, to get us started.
All right. Well, thank you, Maurice, and good evening, everybody. It's really great to see the attendance here for our 2024 State of the Water presentation. So looking forward to providing some really helpful, useful, insightful information in terms of Roseville and its water supplies and our plans relative to water supply reliability. So really quickly, I just want to kind of cover what we are looking at with respect to an agenda for tonight in terms of the topics. And the first we want to cover is really talk a little bit about the high value services that are provided by environmental utilities alongside with a very competitive utility rates. Also want to talk through our current water supplies as well as discuss current water supply conditions. Also looking at anticipated impacts of climate change and how the city is adapting, preparing and adapting to climate change impacts over time. And then we'll finish up with a Q&A. Next slide, please. All right, so in terms of our process relative to our rates, really, it's really important just to kind of emphasize what the overarching structure is relative to setting utility rates. And really what we do is we look at our utility rates every 2 years. And what we incorporate in that is a 10-year projected outlook in terms of expenses and revenues. In that process, environmental utilities has focused in on proactively funding rehabilitation costs via rates for utility infrastructure. As you can imagine, in the city of Roseville, we have a lot of infrastructure that has to be maintained in order to ensure that we have a reliable water supply going forward. And the way we do that is we do that through a pay-as-we-go system, essentially funding over time a rehabilitation account. And what that allows us to do is to pay for those costs as they happen and also avoid costly borrowing. So really creating good value for our customers at a lower rate, if you will. We are remained among the lowest utility rates in the region, and we provide competitive rates, but we also most importantly provide a high level of service. So we really see it as a good value for our customers for the level of service and the rate that's being paid. And then in terms of just the city's sort of financial management, the utilities have had a long history of being strongly managed from a financial perspective and have maintained a favorable financial position over many years. Most notably, a fairly recent upgrade by Standard & Poor's raised our rate from AA to AA plus. So that indicates strength with respect to our financial position here in Roseville. Important just to state that. All right, so moving on, I want to cover the current water supplies that are part of our surface water, mostly surface water portfolio, and talk a little bit in more detail about our groundwater system. So in terms of our supplies that Roseville has available, they are diverse supplies, so both incorporating surface water supplies as well as groundwater sources. The first supply is a supply through the Central Valley Project. Central Valley Project is essentially a federally run water project that supplies many water contractors throughout the state of California. Roseville is a Central Valley Project water contractor. We have a repayment contract. It's an indefinite term water contract with the Bureau of Reclamation for 32,000 acre feet of water. An acre foot essentially is a football field minus the end zones with a foot of water. So to give you kind of context, that's how much water we're talking about. In terms of how many homes that serves, an acre foot will serve roughly 2 to 3 homes per year in terms of water supply. The next surface water supply is through Placer County Water Agency, and that's actually through the Middle Fork Project, which is a county-wide project that was voted by the Placer County voters back in the 1960s. And with that, we've got a 34,000 acre foot contract with Placer County Water Agency. Additionally, recently we were able to successfully negotiate an amendment with Placer County Water Agency to add 10,000 additional acre feet of water as a future option to that contract. So in total, we're looking at a total surface water supply of 76,000 acre feet per year for the city of Roseville. And then finally, we'll get into a little bit more detail, but we do have a system of ASR groundwater wells. There's 6 groundwater wells in the system, and we have more ASR wells planned and also under construction. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. All right, so with respect to the Central Valley Project water supply via Folsom Reservoir. So again, Folsom Reservoir is managed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Roseville does not manage that reservoir. We are just simply a contractor. And so that project was actually authorized by Congress in 1944. The Central Valley Project is a system of integrated reservoirs, canals, and other infrastructure that serves multiple contract cities and other contract users throughout California. Folsom Reservoir, which is the reservoir that Roseville draws its surface water supply from. The construction of that reservoir began in October of 1948. And then ultimately the reservoir was completed in 1956. And then since 1971, Roseville has had access to Central Valley Project surface water. And with that CVP supply, it's a contract. And so there are certain circumstances where there are provisions in that contract that require water cutbacks. And this is specifically during dry or drought conditions. And that is a condition of the contract. And reclamation typically manages how those cutbacks would occur with each of the contracting agencies. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk a little bit about the other sources of surface water through the Middle Fork Project, which is water access through a contract with Placer County Water Agency. So the Middle Fork Project was outlined in 1960. In June 1961, Placer County voters approved a $140 million revenue bond for the Middle Fork Project. And that was voters, when we say voters, it's countywide voters, including voters within the city of Roseville at that time. Construction of the project was completed in 1967. The Middle Fork Project consists of a system of reservoirs, canals, and other infrastructure with 342,000 acre feet of total storage. Again, the surface water from the Middle Fork Project that Roseville receives is now at over 40,000 acre feet with the options included. This water, typically, Middle Fork Project has traditionally been used as a backup surface water supply. However, that water supply over time is going to end up serving the city's needs to ultimate build out of the city here in a couple of decades. Next slide, please. All right, now I'd like to cover the other side of Roseville's water supply portfolio, and that's our groundwater system. And that's via our aquifer storage and recovery groundwater program. So a groundwater, first and foremost, an aquifer storage and recovery groundwater, our program actually started in the early 2000s. ASR wells, as they're called, are unique in the respect that they're different than a traditional extraction well that most people are familiar with. They also have the ability to actually take treated drinking water and actually store that water in the groundwater basin that's underneath Roseville. So it has an extraction and an ability to actually store water through this technology. We have 6 ASR wells in the system. We have 2 more that are going to be developed during 2025. And then the last 2 are scheduled to be constructed and completed roughly around 2027. Typically, ASR wells are used as backup for supply cuts during droughts and emergencies. But certainly there are options in terms of being proactive relative to groundwater recharge, with this, which the city has explored and will continue to explore over time. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and ask Bobby Alvarez to start his portion of the presentation. Bobby.
Thank you, Sean. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bobby Alvarez, and I am the Water Conservation Administrator for the City of Roseville. During my presentation, I'll talk about this season's rain, snow, and lake conditions, which all contribute to our surface water. I'll talk briefly about the water use efficiency regulation, our water reduction, along with how we engage with our customers. We had a good rainfall year of 48 inches. It's slightly below average. As you can see in the past, we typically either have wet years or really dry years. So it was nice to see an average year. Next slide, please. This slide shows the pattern of rainfall. Sometimes we have a wet year, but if the rain pattern occurs before it gets cold enough to freeze, that can be a problem for our surface water. As you can see here, it was perfect timing to create a good snowpack up in the Sierras. Next slide, please. Here is a snapshot of when the snow was at its peak this past June. For the central portion, we had 113% of normal for that date, and the average snow water equivalent of over 29 inches. Next slide, please. Here I'll be covering 2 slides for Folsom Lake, which is Roseville's primary source of surface water. The first slide illustrates peak conditions for this past year, and the next will be current conditions. In June of this year, Folsom reached 97% of capacity and 121% of historical average. Folsom Lake remained above historical average all summer long, and the Bureau did a really good job at managing the releases. Next slide, please. Currently, I'm sorry, I think there's one slide before that. Currently, let's see. Currently, we are at 44% capacity. We are at 95% of historical average. The available storage space will be able to take on the anticipated rain and snow melt this coming season. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here are all the major reservoirs, plenty of blue throughout California. California had a good surface water year. Thank you. Next slide. So the lake Windfall, it's at 466 feet of elevation. Storage Windfall is close to 1 million acre feet. Inflows as of last week were at 583 cubic feet per second, and releases were at a little over 1,500 CFS. The water intake is at 317 feet, but we cannot operate the pump station at 330 feet due to daylighting. Currently, the lake is at 407 foot of elevation, so we have plenty of water before we reach that point. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so in 2018, Governor Jerry Brown signed into law 2 new bills that will require urban water providers throughout California to set new permanent water use targets for their service areas. These 2 bills are Senate Bill 606 and Assembly Bill 1668, also referred to as the Urban Water Use Objective. The standards are residential indoor use, residential outdoor use, water loss, and CII, commercial, industrial, and institutional. There are monetary fines for noncompliance, which will begin in 2027. They are $1,000 per day and $10,000 per day in a drought year. But just to be clear, there's no impact to customers. Enforcement and fines, if imposed, of the regulations are on the water agencies. We are not currently envisioning assigning each home with any individual water budget. Commercial businesses have had a water budget for quite some time prior to this regulation, and those are addressed on a case-by-case basis with each business. Roseville is doing everything to minimize the impacts to residents and commercial businesses through efforts such as improving our leak detection, water-wise house calls, commercial evaluations and surveys, rebate programs, DIY, and education, advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, just to name a few. Please know that the primary goal of these laws are to use water more wisely and eliminate water waste, and to strengthen our local drought resilience. Roseville is doing a great job. We came under budget of actual water use compared to the urban water use objective by 14% for last year's regulatory reporting. And it looks like we are on track to be below budget this reporting year. But if you notice, the parameters of the standards get tighter as the years go on. So we can't let up on the good work we are doing. So if you have any questions on how you can do more, we're here to help. So please don't hesitate to call our office to schedule a house call or a survey to get started. Thank you. Next slide. This slide shows what our water treatment plant treated and distributed by month in comparison to the base year of 2013. You'll notice some huge reduction numbers, especially with having an average precipitation year. That has not always been the case. In the past, many customers would leave their landscape irrigation systems on during rain events, but that has gotten better over time. Next slide, please. This is our gallons per capita compared to population slide. Since 2008, our population has grown by 44%, yet our GPCD reduction is 41% less than it was in 2008, and that's pretty remarkable. In 2020, you see a spike, and that was due to the shelter in place during COVID. Even though commercial buildings were shut down, their landscape irrigation was still operational, so higher use in the home and commercial landscape still being watered caused for a higher consumption for water for that year. And last slide for me. Okay, so engaging with our customers. In our water efficiency section, we have a diverse staff of specialists. We have landscape contractors, certified irrigation auditors, arborists, botanists, leak experts, you name it, we have it. We're asking for, to reduce water use outdoors based on the season. So right now it's getting a little cooler, so you should adjust your irrigation systems. We have our water-wise house calls, which I mentioned earlier, for both indoor and outdoor. We have our rebates, which we expanded for our cash for grass. And we have a couple of websites here for additional resources. So I think that's it for me, and I will pass it along to the Water Utility Manager, George Hansen.
All right, thank you, Bobby. Good evening, everyone. My name is George Hansen, Water Utility Manager. So I'll switch gears here and I'll discuss the impacts from climate change and how climate change has introduced some uncertainty regarding long-term water supply reliability for the American River Basin. Actually, a couple of years ago, 2022, the Bureau of Reclamation, in conjunction with many local water agencies, conducted a study referred to as the American River Basin Study. And the study looked at future climate and hydrology projections, and also identified some important water supply vulnerabilities. So I'll touch on a couple of these vulnerabilities, some of those key issues, and how those will impact the region long term. Next slide, please. So the first of those key findings is shown here on this chart, and it's regarding temperature. So it shows that the projections are estimating that by the end of the 21st century, temperatures will increase by approximately 5 to 6 degrees, and with a more significant impacts being in the upper watershed, which is shown by the darker colors on this slide. Next slide, please. So the next key finding was as a result of the projected increase in temperature. And so it's estimated that runoff will increase during the winter months. And the projections indicate that by mid to late century, there'll be a pronounced shift in the distribution of peak runoff by more than a month. So if you look at this chart here that I'm showing on the screen, you can see along the top portion of the chart, those gray circles, it shows your historical runoff midpoint. It's showing that historical midpoint is right around March. And then as you move towards mid of the century, it's showing that you'll see a shift in that runoff midpoint to about 30 days earlier in the year. And then by the turn of the century, it's projected that it will be much earlier. And so what that means is that we'll experience this shift. And so there'll be a lot more snow melt or runoff occurring much earlier in the water year. And so reservoirs such as Folsom Reservoir will see a lot of added stress because of a lot more moisture coming into the reservoir. So there's going to be more flood releases during the colder months from the Folsom Reservoir, which will result in then potentially reduced water available in the reservoir during summer and fall periods. Next slide, please. So this chart here simply just shows the cycle, what I just described. Temperatures will increase by about 5 degrees by the end of the century. That will mean less snowfall, more precipitation. Because there's earlier flood releases in the year, there'll be the risk of more floods with a lot of release from Folsom Reservoir early in the year. Water availability in the summer and the fall will be reduced because as a result of this, there'll be longer summers and hotter summers. So what does all of this mean for Roseville? So as a water utility, we have adopted a long-term infrastructure planning strategy, understanding that the infrastructure that was built to address 20th century climate conditions won't necessarily provide the reliability we need for our water supply going into the future. So we've had to evolve our thinking and our strategy and our planning. And we are working on designing and building systems and infrastructure that will address different 21st century climate realities. So over the next few slides, I'll walk us through some of the strategies that we've been planning and working on, both to diversify our water supplies and also to provide reliable access to already existing water supplies. Next slide, please. So one of those strategies, Sean already discussed this, is to leverage groundwater as part of our strategy. So Sean already discussed this, so I wouldn't belabor this point. But our ASR program essentially is built to help address long-term climate change impacts, providing reliable water sources as we leverage groundwater. Next slide. One of the things we've been working on is to increase surface water access. And so we're working with PCWA on a few, Placer County Water Agency, on a few joint efforts. Some of those are short-term efforts and others are much longer-term efforts. So here on this slide, I'm showing two existing interties that we have between Roseville and PCWA. At the 5-star intertie on that lower right-hand portion of your screen, we're currently getting ready to do a project to increase reliability of that intertie. So what we'll be doing is we'll be swapping out old equipment, flow meters, etc., installing new equipment, and installing systems to help us to operate that intertie remotely. Currently, we can only manually operate that intertie. So this project will help us have some more operational flexibility and efficiency with operating that intertie. The other intertie in the top left-hand corner of your screen, the Tinker intertie, is one that we did some engineering studies on, I want to say a couple of years ago. We did some field investigations, gathered data, and we used that to establish emergency operational protocols that will guide how we adjust our systems between Roseville and PCWA in the event of extreme drought, dry weather, to allow us to put more water through the intertie to increase water delivery through the intertie if the situation necessitates that. Next slide, please. Another effort we're working on with PCWA is a much longer term effort. This is our raw water conveyance project. It entails developing alternate conveyance infrastructure to allow us to access directly from PCWA, Roseville's Middle Fork Project water supply. So Sean described various water supply contracts at the beginning of the presentation. So currently, the Middle Fork Project water supplies can only be delivered to Roseville by wheeling it through Folsom Reservoir, through a single intake point at the reservoir. And so this project, what it will do is to create an alternate access point upstream of Folsom, which will help provide the infrastructure redundancy and diversification that we need. So this will help reduce risk that stems from depending on a single intake structure that has no redundancy at the Folsom Reservoir. Also, in the event that we run into a multi-year drought scenario where Folsom Lake levels are extremely low, we will be able to access Middle Fork Project water supplies directly from PCWA. So we're developing a multi-phased conveyance project. That's the exhibit we're showing there. Essentially, it will connect our Baton Road water treatment plant to PCWA's treatment plant. It's a joint project with the Army Corps of Engineers. So the federal sponsor is the Army Corps. And so there's a funding arrangement of a 75-25% split. 75% will be funded by the federal government. Currently, we have an initial federal appropriation for $75,000 to pay for initial Army Corps staff time to develop the project partnership agreement. And I believe in 2022, It was 2022. We received a $21 million congressional authorization through the Water Resource Development Act to support funding this project as well. So once we get a project partnership agreement in place, then we'll move on to the next phases of the project. Next slide, please. So the other option that we're looking at as we look to expand our portfolio of options, I talked about a raw water option. This next effort that we're working on with PCWA is a potential treated water supplemental option that we can access during extreme drought periods. So currently, we are conducting a feasibility study of the potential project alignment. This will require purchasing capacity, future capacity in a future phase of PCWA's Ophir water treatment plant, and then building conveyance infrastructure to connect their Ophir treatment plant to Roseville's distribution system. Next slide, please. This next project is the Folsom Dam Reliability Project. It's a joint effort between City of Folsom, San Juan Water District, Roseville, in close coordination with the Bureau of Reclamation. So we are currently conducting technical studies to explore what options might be available to install redundant intake structures, whether it's a barge or pump station on the downstream end of the dam. Again, to build redundancy and help mitigate impacts to our water supply in the event of an extreme drought where the Bureau is limited with what they can pump from Folsom Lake. So we're currently wrapping up those technical evaluations, looking to put forward some recommendations from that study after the work is done to the Bureau of Reclamation for further discussion. Next slide, please. So the River Arc project is another regional effort that Roseville is involved with. The River Arc partners are Placer County Water Agency, City of Sacramento, Sacramento County, and Roseville. This Roseville has been part of this partnership for a while. I think we stepped aside briefly around 2018, thereabouts, to focus on other water resource reliability priorities and efforts. And then late last year, the River partners approached Roseville and discussed the possibility of Roseville rejoining the partnership. At the time, they had received a grant for $5 million from the Wildlife Conservation Board to conduct the pre-design and environmental work for the project. So the timing was right for Roseville. So Roseville City Council, I believe in September, gave approval for Roseville to rejoin the River Partnership. So what that does is it allows us to participate in the phase one of the project, in the environmental phase, to make sure that Roseville's water demands are contemplated in the environmental analysis. So it gives us one more option. As we've been talking about water supply reliability, we're building, our portfolio of options. So this gives us one more option. And then once we get through the environmental phase, as we move into the future, we can look to see, it gives us flexibility regarding how we might participate in the implementation phase of the project. So River originated in 2000 with a water forum agreement. It's really structured to provide a broad range of benefits for the region. For the Sacramento region, it will increase water supply reliability by balancing the two major water supply sources, Sacramento River and the American River. So the project on the next slide, please, will utilize an existing water diversion structure of the Sacramento River. and will essentially build raw water infrastructure to a new treatment plant. The location of the treatment plant is still in the works. The partnership group is looking at a few options. So a new treatment plant will be built, and then there'll be treated water conveyance infrastructure that'll be built to Placer County to serve PCWA, Roseville, and Calem in the future sometime. And then also to Sacramento to serve City of Sac and Sacramento County. So these are some of the options that we're looking at regarding long-term water supply reliability to ensure that we have a broad portfolio of options to address the challenges we see in the future to make sure that Roseville is well positioned to have resilient water supply infrastructure and supply to support our customers through build-out of the city. And I believe that's my last slide. So with that, we will open it up for questions.
Bobby and George, thank you so much for taking the time to step through those slides and give us a little bit more comprehensive picture about the water utility, water supply, and how we're mitigating against climate change. We do have a handful of questions. So I'll start. I kind of batched them. There's some water supply, water quality questions. There's a question about some questions about manufacturing, economic development, and balancing that against water supply, and then a question on infrastructure, more specifically related to groundwater wells. And so maybe let's start with that. One person asked, what is the current storage capacity of the 6 wells, and what will the storage be with all 10 wells?
So the current capacity for the 6 wells is right around 20 MGD. And then as we add 4 additional wells, the 4 wells will add higher capacity wells, at least from the initial testing we've done. So we anticipate that will add close to another 10 MGD. So once we get to 11 wells, we should have a total of about 30, a little about 30 MGD. So at that point, what we'll be doing is, as we approach that point, we'll be actually updating our groundwater strategic plan. We'll be looking at some of the alternate conveyance efforts that we've just talked about, looking to see what kind of supply those will provide to Roseville. And then we'll just have to reassess where we are with our ASR program, whether we expand it, whether we do some of the additional modifications. But currently, the plan for those that we have on the books will put us at about 30 MGD.
Thank you, George. So let's jump into some water supply or water quality questions rather. One person asks, why does our water have such low pH? Last time tested, it was less than 6.
Last time tested, it was pH was less than 6.
Yes.
So yeah, that will probably have to. Our pHs are usually just right around. Should be a little bit higher than that. 6 is a little bit acidic, so we'll probably have to get back to the customer on that question. But usually a pH is a little bit higher than that.
And for the person that asked this question, we probably would want to get your, we probably have your information, so we'll look up who that person is, and then we can follow up offline.
Okay.
And then question related to lead. Are there any lead pipes in our water system? George, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so we just finished. So the lead and copper rule mandate required us to go out and do some survey in the field. We did some kind of a statistical analysis based on the number of connections we have to determine what sample of connections, the sample size that we should go out and evaluate. I think we ended around 840 or something like that, somewhere a little over 800. And all of those connections that we assessed and evaluated, none of those came back with lead. So at this point, we are not aware that we have any lead in the system. That's not to say, there isn't, but at least from the work that we've done, the sample size that we assessed in the field, we didn't come up with any lead. And I think we just submitted that report to the water board, I believe, probably last week.
That's correct. And then a question about economic development. Does Roseville have any significant manufacturing businesses involved in computer chip manufacturing and or processing that consume significant amount of water? Do we see any problems here?
So I'll take that question, Maurice. So just in terms of just general process, so we work closely with the city's economic development department, as well as our development services department in terms of businesses that want to come into Roseville, and really looking at comprehensively what are the utility needs of those businesses. So before we go into having new businesses come in, we need to verify and make sure that we have the utility services that could be provided. So in this particular question is related to water supply. To answer the question is basically, of course, we have to make sure that we have the water supply to serve that business, but also understand it in the context of serving all of our other customers that are out there. So we take it in terms of looking at the specific business and what their demands are, but also keeping in mind that we have obviously an obligation and duty to all the rest of our customers within our service area.
Thanks, Sean. And then any plans to remove fluoride? I know we get this question often about fluoride and the fact that we do fluoridate our water.
Yeah, so that question is somewhat complicated. We are required to fluoridate our water based on our water permit. It is a requirement right now in terms of that. It's more or less sort of dictated through state law and how state law determines systems that are fluoridated or not. The decision to fluoridate Roseville's water was made many decades ago, far before my time, and many folks here probably to a certain extent. So at this point in time, it's part of our water permits. In terms of whether that's going to change over time, we're of course closely tracking what goes on relative to regulatory changes, legislative changes, and certainly if there's any changes there that require us to revisit fluoridation, we'll certainly look at that.
Very cool. And we'll keep the questions going, but we'll switch gears a little bit. Bobby, this one is for you. What else can the city do to push people to remove ornamental lawns? This is a major opportunity to save water. Cash for grass is fine, but we should do more, especially in older neighborhoods with large front lawns that aren't being used.
So to push customers to do more?
To remove ornamental grass, lawns rather.
Well, with the new regulations, as in the slide that I showed earlier, over time, the parameters are going to be getting tighter. They have what they call is a landscape efficiency factor. So basically, the area that you have around your property will be looked at from a budget perspective. And so what we will end up doing, and what we try to do, is send out courtesy notices to people that are going to be over perceived budget for that particular area and size of landscape, what they call irrigable landscape. And we will try to push customers more into possibly looking at some type of sustainable landscape. We do a lot of outreach, thanks to you and your team, Maurice, to get the word out there. But where it really starts to be significant is during drought years. So we have to continue down this road to reduce water as best as we can. But right now there aren't any laws that say that it is a must that you remove things like turf grass in your yard.
Very cool. Thank you. And I'm going to keep you there, man, because the question that I have now is, Question, it's more futuristic. Are we going to have cutbacks on watering next year? And I assume that's just based on water supply conditions. So there's that question. And a follow-up question is, will customers be fined for overuse?
So we are going to continue to have cutbacks. But as I mentioned earlier, the city of Roseville, and as long as we continue to communicate to our customers, both residential and commercial, about water use efficiency, as you can see with the graph that I showed, the trend is going really well in terms of where we were and where we are today. We will be fine in terms of the new regulation come this next year. Where the concern starts to come is around 2027 and 2028, where the parameters even get tighter and the landscape efficiency factors go less and less, which are going to require homeowners to water less. So I would just like to state that as long as we stay on this trend of trying to get educated by our City of Roseville staff on what we can do to reduce more, I think we are doing a really good job and the trend looks really good. And the second part of that question, Maurice?
Second
Sorry.
part of that question, well, it had to do with, sorry, I'm looking for that question now. I highlighted it. Are
Oh,
we
sorry.
going to have cutbacks, water cutbacks next year, and will customers be fined for overuse? Those are the two questions.
Yeah, and regarding the fine, we're not anticipating customers being fined for overuse. We don't like to do enforcement like that, just in terms of trying to force people. We will give courtesy notices. We will still enforce via tags to customers. What we're really trying to encourage is to get people to give us a call so that we can go to their homes and show them where they can reduce usage. So right now, there aren't any plans to find customers.
Yeah, right. The first step is coach customers to compliance.
Yep.
Very cool. There's some other questions related to water efficiency, but I'm gonna jump around a little bit. One question had to do with microplastics. Does Roseville have testing procedures in place to determine if microplastics are in the water supply?
Yeah, I can take that, Maurice, just really quickly. So the current sort of legislative and regulatory environment, microplastics is obviously a big topic, and it's certainly an area of concern for the city of Roseville, as well as many water agencies in California and across the nation. So right now, it's really we're really kind of keeping track in terms of what's happening not only at the state level but also at the federal level regarding what testing procedures may be put in place in the future. We do know it's going to be coming at some point in time, probably in the near future. And what we're trying to do on our end is certainly make sure that we're prepared to do the appropriate procedures based on what we are regulatorily required to do going forward. The other thing too, just to keep in mind, is that in terms of the treatment technologies relative to microplastics, those technologies are emerging at this point in time. And so in many cases, what we like to do is really kind of keep close tabs in terms of what those regulatory requirements are going to be, and then match that up with the appropriate types of technologies if we have to get down to actually treating for microplastics. But as we all know, it's an emerging and hot topic out there, and we know it's coming, and we're certainly going to be prepared to implement changes as required.
Jumping around, George, I want to tee this one up for you. Are there wells recharged every year or just during wet years?
So typically, up until this point, I mean, we recharge only during wet years. So the water we recharge is water that storm water that is excess, and the Bureau is going to release from the reservoir. They'll reach out to agencies and say, there's water available. Typically, it's either referred to as 3F water or Section 215 water. And so agencies that have capacity to take that water will. So Roseville has taken advantage of that. And so in the last, I believe it was last year and probably the year before, we did do some recharge. Last year we recharged, I want to say it was just under 2,000 acre feet. But going into the future, we have capacity in our water supply contracts. So as Sean listed our water supply contracts currently, where our water demand is and the capacity in our water supply contracts, there's additional water that we can recharge, but we have to work through the water board. We have to go through a process and obtain an underground storage supplement to allow us to do that. So it's one of the things we're working on for the future, so that our ability to recharge is not limited to only wet years, but also in normal years, since we have this extra capacity in our water supply contracts between now and build out. That's the idea. The biggest benefit for the regional water banking efforts, is to be able to recharge as much as you can whilst you have capacity in your water supply contracts, for those dry years when eventually they do okay.
That's great. Thank you. And then there's a couple of questions, one again related to ASR, and the question is surrounding concerns with wastewater being put back down into the aquifer. And how the question is asked is, are there any concerns with ASR wells putting treated wastewater back down the aquifer? And some context here is wastewater plants discharge their treated wastewater into our surface water supplies. And a follow-up to that is, how will the introduction of contaminants that are not treated in wastewater facilities going to impact water stored underground, and specifically related to pharmaceuticals?
So,
Oh, go ahead.
okay, Sean, go ahead.
No, maybe George, you can elaborate in a little bit more detail, but I just want to emphasize the fortunate place that Roseville is in terms of location. So they always say location, location, location. It's so true for Roseville, and the reason I say that is that we're in a watershed that essentially is fed through snowmelt from the mountains. That watershed has very little discharges that occur upstream of the reservoir. And I say that in the context of looking at other parts of the state where you have water that flows down rivers and other systems. It's picked up, utilized by customers, and then it obviously is worked through wastewater treatment plants and then actually discharged. In this case, Roseville's in a fortunate geographic position where we don't have a lot of users upstream, specifically wastewater treatment plants that are discharging or anything like that. So in terms of those contamination concerns, certainly there's contamination concerns in other parts of the state, but fortunately we're not in that position based on the geography of Roseville. So George, do you want to give a little bit more detail?
No, I think you covered it, Sean. The only thing I wanted to add is, yes, I think, Maurice, the question was probably, how does putting treated wastewater into the aquifer, how will that affect or impact the aquifer? So we're not doing any of that here in Roseville, like Sean is saying. I mean, our location, what we are putting down is water that, surface water that goes through a treatment plant. So it's water that we're putting in a distribution system that we're serving to our customers. But then when we have surplus flood water, we treat it at a water treatment plant, convey it through a distribution system, and then we bank that water. So there's no wastewater that we're treating and putting in the aquifer, not in this region.
Yeah, we're not doing indirect potable reuse.
Yep.
There's a question relative to the Panattoni development, the Phillip Road site development. And the question is what are your thoughts about the likely contamination of Pleasant Grove Creek and a future South Water Basin by those businesses? As we know, it includes some level of light industrial, and some other uses, including homes. Anyone want to take that one?
I would just say, obviously there is the proposed Panattoni project out there. In terms of what we do in the water utility, I don't think that we see any issues from our particular perspective relative to that. That's not anything that we are regulating or overseeing or anything like that. So I really don't have much to comment about on that question, Maurice. It's really not within the purview of the water utility.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Sean. Climate change question. So we know the Middle Fork project. Is the Middle Fork project impacted by climate change more than Folsom? Is there a way to sort of stare and compare and answer that question?
Well, I think going back to the slide that George had provided relative to the temperature change, when we talk about 5 to 6 degree change in the watershed, looking at that chart, you can see the darker yellow or darker orange color. In the American River Basin study, what was telling, at least from a projection standpoint, is that the impacts of the temperature change are actually more profound in the upper watershed. Now, how that translates specific to PCWA's Middle Fork project system, I really couldn't tell you without going back and really maybe looking at the study in a little bit more detail. But, in terms of the impact to Folsom Reservoir, essentially you got to look at Folsom Reservoir as a reservoir that, number one, is a relatively small reservoir, which within the Central Valley Project, right? It's little less than 1 million acre feet. The reservoir itself is actually built, number one, for flood control. That's the primary purpose of the reservoir. Water supply is secondary. In terms of projected climate change, you have a reservoir that was essentially sort of sized and located based on hydrology from the previous 100 years or so, right? So if you look back at that hydrology, maybe from the middle of the 1950s to maybe about 1850, 1860, or whenever the record started, those tended to be wetter years, right? So you've got a reservoir that essentially was built for 20th century conditions, not necessarily 21st century conditions, at least as far as it's being projected. So the challenge is you've got a very small reservoir. You have essentially less snowpack, which means that water will tend to be more flashier, in other words, more rainfall. And it could be very large amounts of water all at once. And so you're taking a reservoir that was built to capture snowmelt, and then you're actually essentially, because of the changes of climate change, you're seeing less snowmelt and just basically flood flows that are coming through. So that fundamentally changes the effectiveness of the reservoir over time. And so those are the things, when we talk about looking at some alternative ways to access water, store water, et cetera, that's just a recognition of the fact that over time, Folsom and its ability to store water is going to change. And so we're preparing accordingly, kind of getting ahead of that game and making sure that Roseville is well prepared to, weather through any potential changes as a result of climate change.
Thank you for that. I know we're almost up against time. There's 2 questions. Do you want to answer them now? Let's do it. Okay. Question for you real quick, Bobby. How is the water per household allotment determined? And I assume it probably has to do with one of your slides related to gallons per capita per day per person.
Well, I think maybe the question might also be related to the regulation, right? Because of the 55 gallons per person per day indoor use, right? So per person, you got 4 people, 220 gallons, right? That I'm not really sure how this study came about, of where that number came from. I know for the city of Roseville, we don't have separate meters that determines indoor use and outdoor use. So it's an aggregated number. And as I mentioned earlier, it's your irrigable area at your household plus the indoor use of 55 gallons per day. Where I talked about getting a little bit more concerning is based on the state regulation that indoor use becomes less.
Right.
And that's when we're really going to have to buckle down and start to reduce usage somewhere even greater. But remember that the 4 buckets that I spoke to, which are indoor use, outdoor use, water loss, and CII, I think there's a lot that can be done with water loss, like leak detection, for example, and um, commercial landscape with things like non-functional turf. We'll have a much greater reduction there. And then we're just going to combine as a whole. Again, I just want to reiterate that I'm not really clear on how it was determined to have the indoor use at 55 gallons per person. I know that there were studies, but the fines will not go to the customers, they will go to the agency. So we're doing everything that we can to ensure that in aggregate, that number comes below what the state has budgeted for the city of Roseville.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And then one final question related to recharge. Is there a way to determine, it's probably a really low number, is like the person when we do recharge, when there's additional flood water, for example, what's the percentage of water recharge versus the annual Roseville usage?
So it's low, Maurice. Like we said, we are recharging just what the bureau makes available to us, right? So if we round up the number and we say the bureau makes, what was available to us was 2,000 acre feet, and in a year we're using 32,000 acre feet. That is 6-7%, something like that,
Yeah.
of a demand. So it's significantly low. But as we've said, we're going to continue to expand infrastructure. We're looking for ways to be able to recharge what is excess capacity in our water supply contracts, and that's where we'll begin to see economies of scale.
Awesome. Sean, George, and Bobby, thank you so much. And everyone else who joined in today, thank you for taking the time to learn more about the water utility and our water supply. With that, I think we can call it good and you can have your evening back. But we, again, thank you for your time today and look forward to seeing more information about our water supply, our water utility online, and we'll make this recording available likely sometime next week. Thanks again and have a good evening.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.